The second hurdle, which we didn't know we were walking into, is as we're going through the sale of those two properties, now people start talking about this health issue that starts building. And okay, it's building. And by that point, we had identified buyers for both locations, but then it really ramped up. Once we found the property you were going to buy, things really began to heat up so that we didn't know now, were our timelines going to be jeopardized somehow. Hi, this is Chris German from The Apartment Dealer, and welcome back to The Apartment Dealer Show. This is where we bring together the resources, strategies, the network of professionals that can really help you with the information that's necessary to build your financial legacy through multifamily investments. Today, we do something a little different. We're actually going to bring you a client testimonial, an investor, landlord, just like yourself, that we worked with here recently through the 1031 exchange process. And we'll be discussing with him, how did he get his start? What did he originally own that he sold? And what did he move on to? And what was that process like when you have to adhere to certain timelines, when you're giving up an asset that maybe you have certain ties to, you're moving on to the unknown of a new asset and all the new things that comes with that. What was his experience in his words, so that you can see really what's the play-by-play, what's the real life when you're going through a real estate transaction today. So with that, today we have with us Mr. Tony Bradley. Tony, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And of course, you've been an investor, multifamily investor now for a number of years. And we first made each other's acquaintance in 2012. And as I was preparing for our discussion today, I hadn't dawned on me that, because right now we're in the middle of this health crisis, which is also creating, the economic issues. And it seems very reminiscent of when we did our first deal together, which was a 6-unit building, because at that time, credit was tight. When we bought that original building, even the loan at that time was an issue because the lenders had changed their requirements. And so we meet once again, so to speak, in terms of, the same kind of dynamic. And so the audience just is a little more familiar with you, maybe a little bit of your backstory. I know you recently retired, but what did you do as a working man, and how did you come to own multifamily properties?
I'm a pharmacist, and so I've prior to retiring, I owned a pharmacy in partnership with another pharmacist. There was 3 of us. And so over 20 years ago, when I joined the partnership, one of the partners was very much into real estate, and particularly apartments. He owned a 20-unit apartment building at the time. I've always dabbled in real estate, so that may be commercial, boarding care, first trust deeds, single-family residences. And so one of the things we both enjoyed was real estate. He introduced me to apartments, and we ended up forming over 20 years ago an LLC, and utilize that vehicle to purchase apartment buildings, and so that continued to the present day.
Excellent. Yeah, and Joe, who of course now is deceased, just a great guy. I know he and I met initially before I had the opportunity to meet you, and he kind of vetted the properties and then went to you for final approval. And that 6-unit property that we first purchased, even very similarly to this exchange we just did, that property was off market. It wasn't on the open market. It was actually a real estate agent who owned that property. And because she had known that I had sold a lot of multifamily buildings, specifically in Covina, came to me to see if I could help market the building on her behalf. They had some reservations about putting it on the open market. And Joe, who I had been speaking to probably at that time just by phone, maybe a couple of years, when I shared with him it was in Covina. Of course, that was right around the corner from your guys' business, from your pharmacy, and it perked his ears. And you guys took over what was a distressed asset
Yes.
Needed, there was a hoarder living there, and that was part of the issue with the loans because of that particular tenant, and it just a lot of deferred maintenance. And very quickly after close of escrow, you and Joe beautified that place and really turned it around.
Joe and I had this thing that we'd like to, it's kind of simplistic, but set by the ugliest building on the block kind of thing. And so deferred maintenance was always something that we felt we could overcome. Joe loved the working with the contractors and all that aspect of it. And so that property really met it well. It was good location, had quite a bit of deferred maintenance on it, had hoarder issues. And so there was a number of issues, but they were not that difficult to overcome to upgrade the property.
Great, great. And you still hold, that was in 2012, you still hold that property till today. And really since 2012, you hadn't been very active, buying and selling. I know there was different things, you restructured some loans and what have you, but mainly we've just been in contact through the education that, we offer. I know that you've partaken primarily in the video content because you were still working. I still think you haven't made it to one of our live events,
No.
but
I've registered a couple times, but haven't actually made it.
yeah, you threatened to come, but you haven't came. But that's why we do the video. And so I know between that and you had asked me to do a few property evaluations here recently upon Joe's passing. Really, our interaction has just been from the education side for the last, I guess, 8 years or so.
I've, like I said, I've always enjoyed real estate, apartments. I find the cash flow aspect of it. I find some of the tax advantages, the depreciation, the 1031 exchange, which we'll be getting into a little more. I find the ability to borrow on a property. Lenders are very well versed in apartment buildings, and so, and the aspect of you have 6 units and one of them's empty. You still have five individuals paying on them. So all those aspects have always kept me interested in apartment buildings. And so, like a lot of people in apartments, for example, I started an Airbnb recently, and so I still dabble outside of it, but probably my first love is apartment buildings.
And it's interesting, and actually, Gil Figueroa, who you're familiar with, he actually is the one who helped with the loan on that first property. He just did the loan for your new property. He opened my eyes to something that was on the surface, but I guess I just didn't see for myself, in the fact that apartments are tried and true and really have been the best performing of all the commercial asset classes. And even amidst right now, where you have essentially the state's government somewhat encouraging tenants to not pay rent or telling them they don't have to pay rent and telling them that they're protected from evictions, even amidst all that, most landlords I'm speaking to are collecting 90% or more of the rental income in the middle of all this chaos, which goes to show that even the tenants value their home. And just like food, they need shelter. So even if they are being encouraged not to pay and all the different issues going on, they are in fact paying, which makes it that much more stable for an investor like yourself.
Absolutely. We find in the apartments we have, and I think it's also there's a component of doing good screening, having responsible tenants, and so I think the combination of good screening and the people, like you said, people don't want to be in a situation. I think most tenants have always paid monthly, and they don't want to get in that situation. Now, sometimes in these cases, like we've had tenants recently who've had to reach out to family members to assist them on paying rent and things of this sort. But we're finding that the vast majority of our tenants are paying and want to pay.
So now let's flash forward to 2020. So you own this 5-unit property in Glendora and the second property, 4 units in Monrovia. And you'd called me a few months back. You had started contemplating a sale. So maybe walk us through that. Because, I mean, they were 2 very nice pieces of property. But what how'd you come to that decision to sell? What was the thought process leading up to actually listing the properties for sale?
In 2017, Joe passed away, my business partner in the LLC. We had five apartment buildings in the LLC. He passed away. I evoked a buy-sell agreement that both of us had, which is really a good idea if you have a partnership to consider or a buy-sell. So I evoked the buy-sell, which meant that if I wanted to buy out my partner, I could. And so that's what I did is I decided that I would buy out my partner's surviving estate on the five buildings. So in doing that, I leveraged or refinanced the buildings. And as you know, that when you get into smaller, less than 6 units, it's often hard to do that. And so two of the units, the two buildings that we talked about, Monrovia and Glendora, I did basically residential refinance, but I refinanced them and the loan to value on those, one of them was like about 69% and the other one was like 74%. So I really highly leveraged the two smallest buildings that I own. Consequently, what resulted in, even though it allowed me to buy out my partner and I solely own those five buildings now, but the two of the buildings, I incurred significant debt, which my monthly, I was carrying a pretty heavy mortgage payment. Particularly in the 4-unit, I was taking a significant, a couple $1,000 negative on my operating cash flow. And so that made me naturally look at what I could do. And one of the things that came in is to bundle that property with the Glendora, the 5-unit in Glendora, which was pretty much a break-even proposition monthly to month. And with the looking at it, taking advantage of the low interest rates and taking advantage of the 1031 exchange mechanism to hopefully get myself into a better position in a larger, better cash flow property.
And for our viewers, so that we don't go through it here, we have 2 other videos that really explains the 1031 exchange process, and we'll make sure that we put a link here. But very simply, when you own real estate, the government has given you a great gift in the sense that you can sell an asset and all the gains that you realize or all the increased equity that you have in the property, if you sell and roll it over into another property or properties, you pay no tax. Different than if you own stock and you sell at a profit, there's immediate tax to pay. But when it comes to real estate, there's no tax to pay so long as you roll over your winnings, so to speak. One other point that I'll make here too is, of course, in Tony's situation, he mentioned that he had leveraged these properties to be able to buy out the other properties to have little to no leverage on the remaining properties, but consequently had come into a situation where he had a negative cash flow. Now, don't mishear that, well, okay, so that's exactly why Tony sold, but I own my property free and clear, so it must mean the opposite for me, that the opportunity isn't here. What it really boils down to is, what is your rate of return? Now, Tony's situation obviously was the fact that he was at a negative position. But many of you would find that if you evaluated your equity, your rate of return on equity, maybe you're only at, even if you own the property free and clear, you have no debt, your taxes are very low, you might find your rate of return is 2%, 3%, 4%. That's subpar to what the market will have to offer. So that's why it takes an analysis to really know what your rate of return is. And that's really how you preface a return, because when Tony and I first met together, step one was, hey, let's see what these properties are worth and let's see how much equity that you had at your disposal to see if it was even worth going through the exercise. And that's really where we started. And then we had the second hurdle of, okay, we're going to sell 2 different locations. So maybe explain, some of your reservations there, because obviously it's harder to sell 2 different locations to move to one than selling, one to move on to one.
There's always a concern about finding the right property, and then the timeline is always, you're feeling that it's looming behind you, or is the timeline and the escrow period. and to meet the concerns or meet all the requirements of the 1031 exchange. And so you want to, in my case, I've always had a demographic area that I'm particularly interested. I feel I know, I understand, and so I want to keep within that area. And to just keep within that area and yet still work within a time frame, you do feel pressure. And so it's really important to deal with somebody who has a large inventory, that where the likelihood of matching what you need plus and doing it within time frame, whether you can do that or not.
I know one of your initial questions to me was, Chris, can we really sell both properties? Not so much will they sell, we were confident they would sell, but would they sell relatively close to each other, within a certain time frame, so that you could couple the equity together from both to buy one place and not be in a position where, okay, one property sold so early on in the process, the second property sells much later. So now you miss that opportunity of being able to reposition to, one asset, right? We didn't want to miss that opportunity. And that was one hurdle. The second hurdle, which we didn't know we were walking into, is as we're going through the sale of those two properties, now people start talking about this health issue that starts building. And okay, it's building. And by that point, we had identified buyers for both locations, but then it really ramped up. Once we found the property you were going to buy, things really began to heat up, so that we didn't know now, were our timelines going to be jeopardized somehow. And one thing I haven't asked you is, so as we're going through this process, maybe what were your thoughts? Did you have any reservations, anxiety as we were going, from step A to step B, so to speak, as we're selling? You now have entered into an escrow, so you're committed to sell, and we're moving on to phase two. Your thoughts at that time?
One of the things that's really important is to have good communication with your realtor and your loan broker. And so I think a lot of my anxiety was reduced by having that good communication, know where the process is, to know what's your responsibility, and to stay on top of things. So in this particular case, whenever anyone asks me for any information, the bank asks information, or the loan broker asks for information, I try to turn it around right away, because I know that it's vitally important that I do whatever I can to ensure the process goes smoothly. So I think the communication and just trying to stay on top of, and in some ways anticipate what the bank is going to ask for you, to have that information on hand so you can turn it around right away. And I think it kept me, you're much more of an active participant in the process by doing that. But it also reduced my anxiety. And I circle back on the having that communication with knowing where we are, what's holding, if anything's holding anything up, and how we're doing with regard to the schedule. And so since I was always pretty much aware of that, it really made it much less anxiety producing.
And so we now have a buyer for each property. At this point, we had them remove their contingencies very early on. That was vital. So they were committed, because you needed to know that you had buyers that were committed, so that on the other end, when you submit an offer on any property we found, that seller would know that you have a done deal, so to speak. And that's where a lot of people miss the mark. They say, okay, I'll sell when I have the next property in hand. And what many people fail to realize is that next seller is not very inclined to accept your offer unless you have the properties you need to sell in escrow. Now, moving on to the next property. So as you mentioned, you wanted to own within a specific area. Because you had highly leveraged the other two properties, we only had so much equity we were working with. And so it's very specific, my marching orders in terms of finding the building, the next building you were looking to buy. And so we find this excellent 12-unit building in Covina. And interestingly enough, it was on the walking path that you would take when you were working at the pharmacy, and you were very familiar with the location. Maybe if you could explain to our viewers, maybe they're unfamiliar with Covina, just what was appealing about that area?
It's walking distance from the downtown, and it's a very good downtown, a lot of restaurants and small businesses. And so it's like a gas lamp district. And so it was appealing there. It's very close to the park. So that was appealing. It's the tree-lined old oaks and what have you overlooking it. So it's a nice residential, primarily single-family homes. So you're not having a row of apartment buildings. And these were all single-level, 12 units. Great. The maintenance on them was excellent, and a lot of the other buildings I've purchased have not been near this, but really pride in ownership was very evident. And so combination of the excellent location, as you mentioned, our pharmacy, which I owned half the building already, so the pharmacy was very close by, walking distance. The 6 units that you and I had dealt with were also very close by. So, and I tended always to every lunch hour walk the area, and so I've walked numerous times by on that street that we purchased on. So, really had a good feel for the area, and then once we took a look at the apartments, really liked what we saw with regard to not only the right price, but the actual layout and how well they were maintained was just unusually good.
So again, those of you who have followed us so far, we sell 2 different assets that were located in 2 different cities. We have those buildings in escrow, non-contingent. The buyers had removed all their contingencies, meaning if they wanted to back out, they were going to at least forfeit their deposit to Tony. But we had already vetted the buyers. We had no concern that was going to happen. And then something happens, interestingly enough, that even I can't take much credit for, other than we did work with the timelines, but both those buildings actually then sell and close within a day of each other.
Right.
So that's key here, because those of you who know the 1031 exchange process, from the day you close escrow on the property that you're going to sell in order to buy something else, the government gives you 45 days to identify the next properties. Now, of course, we had already identified Tony's next property, and Tony's next building, the 12 unit, actually sold maybe closed escrow within 3 to 4 days of him having closed his other 2 properties. So we almost closed concurrently. And that deal was very interesting because it was not on the open market. So aside of it's in Tony's, area of choice, it's single story. The previous owner did a great job maintaining the units. The majority of the units had been renovated to some degree. The rental rates, while not at market, weren't so far off that they were grossly low, but there's room for Tony to raise those over time. And of all things, the building was not on the open market. So how did this come to pass? Well, again, because of the amount of marketing that we do in-house and really education, the owner of that 12-unit building became familiar with myself because of the education that I've done over the years, and would have hired us to sell his building if it wasn't for the fact that he had already had a relationship with another broker for a number of years. And I respect that. I'm grateful to my clients when they're loyal to me. So he still chose to have his agent represent him. But when I started pounding the bushes on Tony's behalf, because you have to be proactive, I couldn't just wait there, keep hitting refresh on the MLS site, waiting for buildings to come on the market. If you're familiar with multifamily, especially over the last year, supply has been limited. So I know that was one of your concerns, Tony, was would there be ample supply?
And I think you hit on the mark. From my perspective, there's 2 pots. There's the MLS but it seems like so many apartment buildings, the realtors know about buildings that are possibly going to be on the market, or they're in somebody's pocket, but they're not on the MLS. And so when I looked for your assistance, I knew that not only were well versed in the MLS, but you also had a wide range of contacts. And my hope was the combination of the MLS and your knowledge of that secondary, for lack of a better term, but secondary market of apartment buildings would be broad enough to hopefully increase the odds of me finding the right property.
My job was only in representing Tony in this case, was to get Tony the best deal possible. I was not representing the seller. The seller chose to have his own rep. They chose not to put the building on the open market. And what that really led to was us being able to buy the building at an under market value. Because given that property, again, location, single story construction, well maintained, I'm convinced had it been otherwise, we would have been in a competitive bid, and Tony and I would have been competing with other agents and brokers to try to purchase that property. And Tony would have been a great buyer because he was in an exchange, but we were also not buying it all cash. And so we might have been behind the 8 ball. Interestingly enough, we're mid-stride with the property, about 2 weeks away from closing. Because of the health crisis, every commercial bank pivots now. You have banks like Chase Bank raises their interest rates 1.5 points. Other banks begin to raise their interest rate. Now we begin to wonder, is our bank going to try to retrade and change what they had already committed to? And so initially they come to the commercial loan broker and say, we need to delay the closing by 2 weeks. We didn't understand why, and I don't know, Tony, if that was shared with you, but they actually wanted to move the closing 2 weeks. We couldn't understand why, because the appraisal was in, the appraisal had been approved, Tony had done what he needed to do as the buyer. And our only guess is because they had sour grapes that you got such a good rate versus what they were offering, literally within a month's different time frame. That interest rate that you were able to get jumped up by about 1.25 points. And our guess was that they had sour grapes and somehow they were going to try to retrade the deal, as we so to speak, or renegotiate the terms. Even though Tony had signed the loan commitment, look, at the end of the day, if the bank's not going to fund the loan, they're not going to fund the loan. And so they could have played a game. So our commercial broker leaned on them and said, no, we need to close on time. The other issue that came up is, and as I mentioned early on, is the fear, would tenants pay rent? And that was where we were. That was a second thought, is maybe the lender wanted to get past the first of the month to see if some tenants would not pay and then use that as an excuse to cut the loan amount. So we didn't want to go past the first of the month because we didn't want any of these unknowns. So I leaned on the seller and the seller's agent for us to close the way we needed to close. The loan broker leaned on the bank so we would close on time. And it all worked out. And as I mentioned, we closed the 12-unit building literally days after we closed the down leg properties, as we refer to them.
Even looking back on it, Chris, and this is a perfect case where all the ducks stayed in a row. So often we line all the ducks up and they fall down. And I think a little bit you have to anticipate things will fall down, and you have to back up. And I'm one who's always, I guess I think sometimes that there's a good chance something's not going to work out, and I'm always trying to think of a backup plan or what have you. But here's one case where I think it's a real testament to everyone working together, is that, like I said, it's a little bit amazing. Our closing dates were on Glendora and Monrovia was the 20th, and our closing date on school was the 24th, and we made it not even 1 day extension. So I think that's pretty amazing.
That's why we had built in those safety valves that you
exactly
mentioned, is because even I know, as best as the ducks, you line them up, one duck starts to waddle off this way. And so we had those safety valves if we
Right.
needed them, and we would have been in good shape.
Like I said, overall, I felt that in the climate that we're in, to be able to meet our 45-day escrow with not a single day extension, I think just attest to Gil's hard work and a lot of other people's hard work to make that occur.
Now, if we go back to our initial meeting we had at Starbucks, and it's crazy to think that today we couldn't even meet at Starbucks because of everything going on. But we meet at Starbucks, and you made the comment once you agreed to sell and list your two buildings for sale that, hey, Chris, I want to be like one of those testimonials that we do at our live luncheons where I actually go out into the crowd and normally I pick somebody, a client out of the crowd. They don't know, it's not a setup, so that they can right off the cuff just share their experience of having worked with us or whatever strategy they were using that we help them implement. And you mentioned, hey, I want to be one of your success stories. So here we are, you're on the Apartment Dealer Show. You are a success story. And to that effect, now having worked with us, becoming familiar with our brand, what was your overall experience of having worked with us?
It's been very positive. Like I said, I felt that we on the two properties, the selling, our goal was to close on the 20th, and then on the new property to close on the 24th, and we made those without a single day extension in any case. So my goal when coming in and talking with you, one of the things was to have a large to deal with somebody who knew the market, knew the ins and outs of the 1031 exchange. There's a lot of very active realtors who don't do much in 1031 exchange. So I felt it was important to deal with somebody who did deal with 1031 exchange. Also somebody who had, frankly, knew of a large inventory, so that, again, to meet one of my criteria of the area. And so that absolutely occurred. As you said, this property wasn't on the market. And I had the feeling that they sought you out to talk to you because of your knowledge and where you are in the marketplace. And then Gil following through. Both of you guys are both very busy people. And so, so when we did communicate, sometimes we didn't have a lot of time to communication, but all those key areas to communicate occurred. I knew what was going on in the process. I knew what the situation was. I knew what the next thing they were going to ask me on. So I felt all my expectations were met, is really what I'm saying.
Great. Well, and kudos to you, because again, many investors, they're so fearful of what I call it, I guess change is really what it boils down to. They're so fearful of change that many of them would have just stayed where you were, saying, hey, well, you know what? Even though I'm negative on this one property, better to be negative than go into the unknown. And now I sell and buy something. What if I end up in a worst case? And here you sold 9 units, you end up with 12, and it meets all the other requirements. But obviously it takes a leap of faith. I could have made all the promises, but it truly does take a leap of faith on your end. So kudos to you. And obviously that's why you're winning. I mean, you own multiple locations. You and Joe and now yourself have amassed a nice sized portfolio, manageable, right? And so it's not like you're one of these individuals that have hundreds and hundreds of units. You probably could share with everyone, you're like them, because many of our clients either are small entrepreneurs, work 9 to 5, start out investing on the side because of the hope that their investments will provide for them one day. That's what you've done over time, and it's really worked out.
I think I'm like a lot of people who are building, this is going to help fund my retirement. This is what is going to help fund my retirement. It's diversified me. Certainly I own equities, but I think you have to be, particularly I think this pandemic has shown it, is that you don't know what's going around the corner. So you have to have some level of diversification.
Tony, thank you again. Thank you for your time, especially at a time like this. I wish you and your family well, and it looks like we're going to be getting out of this hopefully sooner than later. It looks like things are days are getting brighter, and now they tell us that we can at least walk at the beach. I mean, things are progressing, right?
Yes, yes. So similarly, I hope all our viewers that are out there, I hope they're safe and their families are safe, and I'm very much hoping that things open up in a safe manner and we can get beyond this.
All right, sir. Well, thank you again.
Thank you.
I hope you found today's show informative. I hope it helps you along with your investment strategy. If you're curious as to what are some of those safety valves that Tony alluded to that we put in place when you're going through the 1031 exchange process, what is our proprietary approach when we're walking one of our personal clients through the 1031 exchange, please feel free to reach out to me. We're more than happy to have a consultation with you. If you like this video content, be sure to like the video. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you're looking for a different type of content and you're on Facebook, go over to Facebook, The Apartment Dealer, follow us there. And on Instagram, different content is being shared there. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at The Apartment Dealer. As always, I hope, again, this information serves you well. And until we see each other again, I wish you positive cash flow, tenants who behave, much protection from Uncle Sam, and all the best to you and your family. Talk to you soon.